There is a mission in the history of the Royal Air Force that, on paper, should never have been attempted. It called for heavy bombers to fly at night, at treetop height, over hundreds of miles of enemy territory, and then drop a weapon that had never been used in combat. A weapon that had to bounce across open water like a skipped stone, at a precise speed, at a precise height, in the dark, while anti-aircraft guns fired directly at the aircraft from point-blank range. That mission happened on the night of the 16th and 17th of May, 1943. History remembers it as the Dambusters Raid. To understand how it succeeded, we first need to understand how close it came to being not a triumph, but a catastrophe, because almost every part of what made this operation famous also made it, by any reasonable military calculation, a mission that shouldn't have worked. By 1943, the Ruhr Valley was the industrial engine of the German war machine, steel mills, munitions plants, coal mines, all of it dependent on a resource that seems almost too simple to be a strategic target: water. The Mürchen Dam, a curved gravity dam 40 meters high and 650 meters long, supplied both hydroelectric power and the pure water the Ruhr's steel-making industry depended on. Alongside it stood the Eder Dam, which fed the canal system moving industrial freight, and the Earth-and-Sorp Dam, providing further water storage for the region. British planners had identified these dams as high-value targets years before the raid was possible. The problem was never strategic logic. It was physics. A dam wall is not something a conventional bomb can simply crack open. The water pressure at depth actually helps hold a dam together against a surface blast, and torpedo nets strung across the reservoirs made underwater attack impossible for aircraft-launched weapons of the era. What the Royal Air Force needed was a weapon that had never existed, something that could reach the base of the dam wall at depth and detonate there, bypassing both the torpedo nets and the dam's own structural resilience. That weapon came from an aeronautical engineer named Wallis, and its origin story is almost absurdly domestic. Wallis developed the concept by experimenting with marbles bounced across a tub of water in his own back garden, working out the physics of how a cylindrical object, given the right backspin and released at the right speed and height, could skip across open water toward a target, clearing the torpedo nets entirely before sinking against the dam wall and detonating at depth. The weapon was codenamed Upkeep. It was a 9,000-pound cylindrical mine designed to bounce across the surface until it struck the dam, then sink and detonate via a hydrostatic fuse at a depth of 30 feet. The concept was elegant: building it, training crews to deliver it, and finding an aircraft willing to fly the mission it required. That was where the real difficulty began. Implied visuals: RAF Scampton Airfield, Lancaster bombers being modified, low-level night training over reservoirs, Guy Gibson briefing his crews. At the end of February 1943, while trials of the bouncing bomb were still underway, a new squadron was formed specifically to carry out the attack, based at RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire. It was initially called Squadron X. The speed of its formation outstripped the RAF's own namming process, before becoming 617 Squadron. Command went to Wing Commander Guy Gibson, 24 years old, and already a veteran of more than 170 bombing and night fighter operations. Bomber Command's Arthur Harris had initially opposed diverting his aircraft for the mission at all, which tells you something about how unconventional this operation looked even to the people running Britain's strategic bombing campaign. Gibson had roughly 3 weeks to assemble aircrew and ground staff, and roughly 8 weeks total before the mission would need to fly. 21 bomber crews were pulled from other 5 group squadrons, drawn from Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, men who, in many cases, had simply reached the end of one tour or the start of another, reassigned into a unit whose actual purpose almost none of them yet knew. Nobody in the squadron, except its most senior members, was told the real target until the day of the raid itself. What the crews did know was that they were about to spend weeks doing something no bomber crew had trained to do before: flying at extremely low altitude, at night, over water, with no room for the normal margin of error that altitude usually provides. The training began at 0 feet, and pilots quickly found they could not accurately judge their height over open water in darkness, a problem that had to be solved before the mission could work at all. The solution, tested and refined through practice runs, was 2 spotlights mounted on the aircraft's fuselage, angled so their beams converged into a single point on the water's surface only when the aircraft was flying at precisely 60 feet, the exact release height upkeep required. Extensive testing determined the bomb needed to be released from 60 feet at a ground speed of 232 miles per hour, spinning backward in order to skip correctly across the reservoir surface and strike the dam wall with the right residual momentum to drive it downward before detonating. Every part of that specification had to be held constant by hand by a pilot flying at night, under fire, with only feet of clearance between his aircraft and the water below him. There was no automation for this. There was no prior combat experience to draw on. There was only 8 weeks of practice runs at a bombing range in Kent, and the hope that it would translate to the real thing over Germany. The target date was set for the full moon in mid-May, when the reservoirs would be at their fullest, and the moonlight would be bright enough for the pilots to fly the profile the mission demanded. There would be no second attempt. The bombs, the training, and the narrow window of the right moon phase meant this was a mission that had to succeed the first time it flew, or not succeed at all. On the evening of the 16th of May, 19 specially modified Lancaster bombers took off from Scampton, carrying 133 aircrew toward the Ruhr Valley. The route in was itself part of the danger. Hundreds of miles flown at treetop height across occupied territory, threading between known flak positions, navigating largely by dead reckoning and map reading at night, with no room to climb to a safer altitude without giving away the aircraft's position or losing the precision the mission required. Losses began before the dams were even reached. One aircraft, flown by Flight Lieutenant Robert Barlow, struck an electricity pylon and crashed en route to the Sorp Dam, killing the entire crew, a reminder that low-level flight at night carried its own lethal risks entirely separate from enemy fire. The aircraft that reached the Merhen Dam attacked in sequence, one crew at a time, each aircraft making its run while the others orbited nearby waiting their turn, a formation that meant every crew watched the aircraft ahead of them fly directly into the dam's anti-aircraft defenses before making the same run themselves. The 2 direct hits scored on the Merhen created a breach roughly 250 feet wide and nearly 300 feet deep. Around 330 million tons of water poured through the gap into the Ruhr Valley below. Gibson's own account of the run captures the mission at its most exposed. His description of the final approach describes the flak as visible and close, his crew adjusting the aircraft's spotlights and guns as they closed the final distance, low enough that the defenses could see them clearly. With the Merhen breached, part of the force pressed on to the Edda Dam, an even more difficult target due to the terrain surrounding its reservoir. The Edda was successfully breached as well, while the Sorp Dam, an earthen structure requiring a fundamentally different attack profile, sustained only minor damage, the one primary target the raid did not fully achieve. By the time the surviving aircraft turned for home, the cost of the mission was already severe, and the sun would rise on a Ruhr Valley transformed by flooding that no one on the ground had time to prepare for. Of the 19 crews that had set out, 8 did not return. Of the 133 aircrew who flew the mission, 53 were killed, a casualty rate of almost 40%, an extraordinary loss rate for a single night's operation, even by the standards of Bomber Command's already costly campaign. 3 more aircrew survived being shot down only to become prisoners of war, among them men from Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood's crew, whose aircraft was hit and destroyed during its own run at the Merhen. This is the part of the story that the word impossible tends to compress out of view. Success, in this case, did not mean an operation that went as planned. It meant an operation where nearly half the men who flew it did not come home, where aircraft were lost to flak, to terrain, and to the sheer unforgiving margin of error that low-level night flying at high speed demanded, and where the crews who did return had watched, in real time, exactly what happened to the aircraft that failed to clear the target in time. The raid's fame was built, in large part, on precisely this cost. It was not a clean demonstration of a clever weapon. It was a mission whose success depended on crews repeatedly flying, one after another, into defenses that had already killed the men ahead of them, because there was no other way to deliver the weapon that Wallis had built. The material results of the raid were significant, though not absolute. 2 hydroelectric power stations were destroyed and several more damaged, along with factories and mines across the flooded region. The human cost on the ground was severe. An estimated 1,600 people drowned in the flooding, a toll that included a large number of forced laborers and prisoners of war held in camps directly in the flood's path. The economic disruption, however, proved less permanent than the raid's planners had hoped. German industry in the Ruhr Valley was largely operational again within a few months, with an estimated 30,000 workers commandeered to complete repairs, and production returned to normal levels by September, roughly 4 months after the dams were breached. But measuring the raid purely by industrial output missed what both sides understood immediately about its real effect. The operation forced Germany to divert substantial resources, labor, and anti-aircraft defenses into rebuilding and protecting the dams, resources pulled in part from the Eastern Front, where German forces were engaged in the war's largest land campaign against the Soviet Union. And on the British side, the psychological effect was immediate and largely uncomplicated by the raid's material limitations. The press reported the operation as an unambiguous triumph, and 617 Squadron's aircrew were treated as national heroes. Guy Gibson was awarded the Victoria Cross for his leadership during the raid, one of 34 decorations given to the squadron's survivors at Buckingham Palace the following month. For Wallis, whose bouncing bomb had made the entire mission possible, the celebration was tempered by something the newspapers largely left out. The scale of the losses among 617 Squadron's aircrew weighed on him heavily even as the operation was publicly celebrated as a triumph, a tension that sits at the center of how this mission should actually be remembered, as both a genuine technical and tactical achievement and as an operation whose cost fell almost entirely on the young men who had to fly it. 617 Squadron did not disband after the raid. It adopted a motto that captured exactly what it had just done, après moi le déluge, after me, the flood, and went on to become Bomber Command's specialist precision unit, later delivering the enormous tall and grand slam bombs designed by Wallis against targets, including the German battleship Tirpitz. What makes the Dambusters Raid worth returning to, decades later, isn't simply that an impossible-sounding plan worked. It's the specific, unglamorous reasons it worked at all: a weapon invented with marbles in a garden tub, a squadron built from scratch in 3 weeks, a targeting system improvised from 2 ordinary spotlights because pilots couldn't judge their height over water in the dark, and 19 crews who had 8 weeks to master a flight profile with 0 margin for error before flying it, once, into some of the most concentrated defensive fire of the war. 2 of the 3 dams were breached. The third survived. Nearly 40% of the men who flew the mission did not return. German industry was disrupted, then substantially rebuilt within months. None of that fits neatly into the word triumph, the way the raid is usually remembered. It fits better into the word actually used to describe it going in impossible, not because it couldn't be attempted, but because succeeding at it required almost everything to go right, at night, under fire, on the first and only try it was ever going to get. It went right, not perfectly, not without enormous cost, but right enough on a single night in May of 1943 to earn 617 Squadron a place in history that no amount of hindsight has diminished.